Welcome. My name is Forrest Longman. I am the current president of City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people, and it has been this way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank all of our volunteers who make our programs possible. I'd also like to thank KMRE radio board member Robert Clark, who is producing today's program, and BTV10, who will be broadcasting it for their viewers. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support. They are Larson Gross, Lummi Commercial Company, Danny Neal of the Mulyat Group, the Opportunity Council, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, Whatcom Community Foundation, and Bruce and Claudia Dizent. Next month, City Club will discuss youth mental health in the age of anxiety and why it matters to everyone. Dr. Cislina Ledbetter, a clinical psychologist at Western Washington University, Vice President of Counseling and Wellness, will look at some of the root causes and talk about ways adults can address these mental health issues so that society as a whole will be healthier in the future. Finally, I'd like to turn things over to Jane Freudenberger. Jane is the chair of the City Club Program Committee. She'll introduce today's participants and moderate the program. Jane?
Hi, thank you, Forrest. In August 2021, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report that stated that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and some trends are now irreversible. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said the working group's report was nothing less than a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. He continued that we must act decisively now to keep 1.5 alive, which we know was the agreed upon frame at the Paris Accords for the rise in temperature. We are now too close to that number. For those who would call this report alarmist, that we need to slow down and not make big changes too fast, I will remind them that the report came from 234 well-respected scientists from 66 countries, and they agreed categorically that global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years. Where does that leave Whatcom County? It's just a speck on the global planet. While some world leaders dither, small and large cities and counties have marched forward with new ideas about sustainability, energy sources, agricultural practices, and much more. This afternoon, we'll hear from two such leaders who are leading the march here in Whatcom County. Ellyn Murphy is the chair of the Whatcom County Climate Impact Advisory Committee, and Chris Elder is the Whatcom County Senior Planner. They will present the 2021 Whatcom County Climate Action Plan, which was adopted by the County Council on November 9th, 2021. Ellyn has an MS in forest science and a PhD in hydrology. She spent most of her career as a research hydrologist, division director, and program manager at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, a U.S. Department of Energy research laboratory in Richmond, Washington. Since retiring to Bellingham, she has been very involved in climate issues. Chris Elder is a senior planner in watershed management with Whatcom County Public Works. Over his past 6 years working for the county, he has supported agricultural and ecosystem-related long-range planning efforts. He holds a BA in environmental biology and an MS in agriculture, and worked in agriculture for 10 years prior to working for the county. Chris was the county's liaison to the committee. Please welcome Ellyn and Chris. And I think we're starting with Ellyn today.
Well, thank you, Jane. And let me see if I can get this started here. Chris and I also would like to thank City Club for the opportunity to present the Whatcom County Climate Action Plan. So let's get started here. First, I want to talk about the process of developing the Climate Action Plan. I was appointed to the Climate Impact Advisory Committee, or CIAC, as we like to call it, in January of 2019. We started planning process by first engaging people in the Whatcom community. I'm retired, but many of the members of CIAC have real daytime jobs and families. So I have to give a shout out to the local League of Women Voters who really carried the weight on both interviewing community members and helping us write the final report. Thank you so much. We interviewed well over 100 community members and leaders to understand their views and needs regarding climate change. This report is available on the committee website. We started 2020 very optimistic that we could form working groups of both CIAC members, as we call ourselves, and community experts. These groups would develop strategies and actions for the different areas. However, due to the pandemic, the working groups had to rethink how they could accomplish their goals. We all had to learn how to do meetings via Zoom, for example. Trying to contact people who are working remotely was a challenge when you only have their phone numbers from their office. So I believe that the pandemic delayed our schedule by several months. Cascadia Consulting provided 3 reports. The greenhouse gas assessment for 27 was completed in the summer of 2020. This report was the most important for organizing our work on the Climate Action Plan. Strategies and actions for different areas in the built and natural environment were presented at the CIAC meetings for review by the entire committee. The focus of 2021 was writing. Last July, we had a 30-day public review procedure for the draft plan, and that was followed by additional revisions. Finally, a resolution to accept the plan was passed by the council on November 9th, as Jane said. The total emissions in Whatcom County were over 7.5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. To give you an idea of how high this is almost 3 times the state per capita emissions. Our emissions are 35 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per person, where the state is 13 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per person. Industry is the main contributor. It is not unusual to have this high of emissions in a county that has refineries, and we have 2 of them. 35 metric tons of CO2 equivalent is similar to the per capita emissions in oil-rich Middle Eastern countries. For statewide emissions, transportation is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases at 45%. Industry, ag, and waste combined only account for 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions at the state level. The committee's charter instructed us to follow the Paris Agreement on greenhouse gas emissions. So I cannot emphasize enough how significant and urgent our challenge is. We need to reduce emissions by 7.6% every year between now and 2030 to meet these Paris Agreement. The evidence for climate change is all around us, from the heat dome in last June to extreme weather events that we experienced last fall. This 3-day heat dome resulted in misting of cows and people, destruction of about 30%, and the death of coastal sea life. The heat dome was directly attributed to climate change by the World Weather Attribution Initiative. This is a consortium of 27 international scientists who synthesized the results using 21 different climate models to evaluate the June heat wave. They found that it was virtually impossible to model this heat dome unless they accounted for the climate change and the ocean warming that had already occurred. With continued global warming to 2 degrees C, this 1 in 1,000 year event today could occur roughly every 5 to 10 years by 2040. The recent flooding events in the county have not been modeled and attributed specifically to climate change. However, for years, scientists have been warned us that climate change will lead to extreme weather events. And most of us can agree that the amount of rainfall that fell in such a short time period was extreme. The county climate action plan is divided into the built environment and the natural environment as shown in this diagram. From the standpoint of mitigation and adaptation strategies, mitigation is the primary strategy for the built environment, and adaptation is the primary focus for the natural environment, although both mitigation and adaptation play a role in each area. Electricity or electrification is the key strategy for reducing emissions in the built environment. Strengthening our water resources is key to protecting vulnerable food systems and ecosystems in the natural environment. Land use codes and regulations are probably the most important tool the county has to reduce emissions and adapt systems so they can adjust to changes in climate change. We need to start thinking about these different areas together as systems. For example, in this report, we combine buildings and electricity because we need to start thinking of buildings as grid assets, and that buildings use electricity, but also can produce and store electricity. Likewise, when the climate action plan is revised in 5 years, we need to consider buildings, electricity, and transportation as an integrated system in our climate strategies. Our challenge is that emissions are much higher in the built environment than the ability for the natural environment to sequester or store that carbon dioxide. So we're basically out of balance. Land use is the fulcrum that can help reduce emissions in the built environment and strengthen our ecosystem so that they can store more carbon in the natural environment. We need to balance these systems and reach net zero emissions by 2050. Excuse me. Throughout the climate action plan, we talk about climate resilience. Climate resilience is not the same as sustainability. Climate resilience is about the capacity of a system, whether you're talking about transportation, energy, food supply, or ecosystems, to deal with climate change and continue to operate. As the Venn diagram shows, climate resilience is a combination of mitigation or the reduction of CO2 emissions in the blue area and adaptation in the green area. Adaptation is primarily about strengthening the health of ecosystems so that they can withstand the impacts of climate change and continue to operate. Adaptation can also be about altering human behavior to lower emissions in the built environment. We have to keep in mind that climate change will continue to occur, and when it does, our systems can recover with proper planning and policy decisions. This is why climate resilience is the ultimate goal. The Climate Action Plan is designed to be both educational and provide a blueprint for action. One of the key issues identified in our 2019 community research project was a lack of leadership on climate issues. Implementation of this plan assumes that the county has formed an Office of Climate Action and hired a full-time climate action manager to direct this program. I'm happy to say that the county's support is evident in that they have provided funding in their recent biennial budget for a climate action manager. I do want to mention that after working with Chris over the last 3 years, I can say we have an excellent leader for climate issues in the natural environment. The county should consider hiring a staff member who can lead the changes that are required in the built environment. We will also be requesting funding for a data information analyst. This is an extremely important position. I cannot emphasize enough the need to collect data to measure the effectiveness of our strategies and actions. Because the climate action contains over 40 different strategies and over 200 actions, the county council and the county leadership requested that we put forward our first year priorities. We will discuss these 10 priorities in the next few slides. I will describe the priorities in the built environment, and Chris will discuss the priorities in the natural environment. Modeling by the State Department of Commerce indicates that Washington's electricity needs will double by 2050. At that time, Washington will become a net importer of renewable energy, wind from Montana and solar from the Southwest. Currently, we do not have sufficient transmission to bring this renewable electricity to Whatcom County. And transmission takes a decade or more to build, so this is a long-term challenge. Therefore, our focus this decade should be on local renewable energy. During our interviews in 2019, community members were constantly asking for renewable energy, local renewable energy, specifically community solar. We need a leader at the county level who can advocate for state legislation that encourages adoption and growth of renewable electricity with an emphasis on community solar and addresses our long-term needs for transmission and distribution. In this diagram of northern border states, only North Dakota has less solar than Washington. I believe Washington has been slow to adopt solar because of our wealth in hydroelectricity. Vermont, which is not known for its mild winters, has 15% solar photovoltaics, and Massachusetts has 18%. Minnesota has the fastest growth rate in solar photovoltaics. This may be because they are allowing competition in community solar development. The US economy was built on a model of a top-down or centralized generation of electricity. This system has served us well over the last century and created one of the most productive economies in the world. The electricity grid, however, is increasingly subject to cascading failures, which basically means when something fails at the top of this diagram, all the downstream systems fail. Last year, Texas experienced a winter freeze affecting about 4.5 million people. Gas pipelines and natural gas generation were disrupted, which led to Texas having rolling blackouts. Hurricane Ida in August of 2021 knocked down new transmission lines and distribution lines, also causing blackouts. Wildfires knocked out transmission and distribution in last year's Oregon, California wildfires. To really create climate resilience in our energy system, we need more generation of local distributed energy resources such as renewables and energy storage. The future will need to have much more local community and rooftop solar, energy storage, and microgrids. A microgrid allows your home or an emergency shelter to operate independent when the grid goes down. This is what we call a resilience center in our climate action plan. Innovation is equally important. For example, in 2020, Portland General Electric incentivized battery storage at 500 homes. In exchange, PGE could use a portion of this energy to accommodate peak electricity demand. In essence, they created what's called a virtual power plant. As the City of Bellingham Climate Task Force found, the biggest impediment to electrification is the higher initial cost of heat pump equipment. So this has been a long-winded background explanation to introduce another one of our first-year priorities. We need to adopt new financial tools and incentives that will accelerate electrification of existing buildings and installation of distributed energy resources for climate resilience. The county is already piloting a CPACER program for commercial building financing, but we also need a PACE program for residential buildings. BP is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the county at about 2.1 million metric tons of CO2 annually in the 2017 assessment. So the first year priority is to start a dialogue with BP management on how they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The Cherry Point Amendment is a good example how the county can use land use regulations to curtail greenhouse gas emissions at the local level. BP has a corporate goal to get to net zero emissions by 2050. So BP is transitioning fast, especially in Europe, investing in green hydrogen fuel and EV charging stations. Locally, BP will spend about $269 million and reduce emissions by 7% by updating some of their processes. It is possible, but it will be expensive and difficult to achieve a 50% reduction in industry emissions for 2030. So we really need innovation in this area. For example, since transportation is the state's greatest source of greenhouse gas emissions, we should look at the current refineries as a possible solution. Low carbon and renewable fuels are desperately needed as we transition to electrification of transportation and buildings. The largest impediment to electric vehicle adoption is range anxiety. Therefore, the first year priority focuses on acquiring funding and installing EV charging stations across the county. Similar to what the City of Bellingham did recently to acquire $1.5 million in funding for more EV charging stations in the city. EV adoption has been accelerating worldwide, especially since so many car manufacturers are offering more models and reducing their focus on internal combustion engines. In 2010, only 395 EVs were sold worldwide. As of the third quarter of 2021, over 1.7 million EVs were sold, and over half of those were sold in Asia alone. Incentives are important. For example, in Norway, only 20% of new cars sold in 2015 were electric vehicles. Last year, this jumped to about 2/3 of all new cars sold were electric. One strategy that Norway used was to eliminate the country's very high sales tax on new electric vehicles. The growth in EVs sets up another technology already deployed in other countries called vehicle-to-grid. The battery in your electric vehicle can store a lot of energy, and in some countries, they already allow their utilities to use a portion of that stored electricity when the demand for electricity is high. People are essentially selling electricity back to the grid, which is why it's called vehicle to grid. Think about it. Tesla Powerwall has about 13 kilowatt hours of energy. A Prius battery has almost 3 times that, about 38 kilowatt hours. And the new electric Ford F-150 has about 90 kilowatt hours, enough to power a house for about 3 days. So we need to start thinking about using, especially when our cars are just sitting in our garage, to sell some of that electricity back to the utility. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Okay, thanks, Ellen, and thanks, Jane, and members of the Bellingham City Club for having me here today. Again, my name is Chris Elder, and I'm a senior planner in watershed management for Whatcom County Public Works. And I was just doing the math as Jane was doing my introduction, and I think I've actually been with the county for almost 8 years now. And it's been a roller coaster. I will say that I started back in planning and development services, working as a long-range planner, had the great opportunity of working with the Agricultural Advisory Committee and the Wildlife Advisory Committee, as well as the Climate Impact Advisory Committee. And I served as the Purchase of Development Rights Program Administrator for 5 years during that time, before shifting over to Public Works a couple years ago, trying to tackle our broader watershed management challenges. And it's been an enormous learning experience and kind of pleasure for me supporting the Climate Impact Advisory Committee back at its inception in 2017. I've had a number of really valuable and instructive committee members over time, a lot of who have graduated on to public office, such as the Bellingham Mayor Seth Fleetwood, whose name I saw on the call today, as well as Representative Sharon Shoemake and Alex Ramel, and now our newest council member, Kaylee Galloway. So once I'm done with public service, I'll probably be applying to the committee so that I can get my own start in public office. But today I'm going to try to highlight a few of the priorities that the committee recommended. And one of the challenging or interesting lines to walk as a staff person is to try to balance or identify the intersection between what is identified in the regulations and kind of the mandates, both at the local, regional, and federal levels, and then what do we identify as a community within our planning documents. So as I kind of describe some of these priorities today, I'm going to try to provide some differentiation between what we are kind of mandated or required to do, and then where do these planning efforts kind of meet those regulations or meet kind of the programmatic implementation of the county government specifically. So this number 5 priority here of the short list out of the climate action plan is to implement the regional trails plan to expand the regional trail network for commuting, recreation, and emissions reduction. Throughout development of the transportation chapter of our plan, kind of the recognition that, you know, getting people out of combustion engine vehicles was a significant way for the community to reduce emissions, and getting them onto their own 2 feet or onto bicycles, or myself living out in the county, getting back onto horseback could be an effective way to go to school, to go to work, to go to the store. And, you know, this has been a very interesting specific action because this is not a new recommendation in county government. Looking back in time, you see there's the 2007 bike pedestrian plan. Before that, there was the 2004 chain of trails plan. And even before that, Whatcom County adopted the natural heritage plan back in 1990. So these recommendations, which not only enhance kind of the values, the community values of Whatcom County, also have this nexus with the climate action plan. So again, I think this recommendation tries to, you know, re-engage policymakers in the community to state that not only does this have a significant climate nexus, a carbon reduction and, you know, natural ecosystem appreciation component, but it's also something that we have already identified as a community value for a long time. Regionally, my understanding, not being a transportation planner, is that a lot of these non-motorized planning efforts actually revolve around the Whatcom Council of Governments. They have a duty to coordinate a lot of these regional transportation planning efforts, and they are actually in the process currently of updating their 2040. I'm probably not going to get the name right, but their transportation planning process. And in that, I will note that they have actually identified multimodal transportation improvements as one of their top priorities, in addition to improving their own environmental sustainability. So from a regional compatibility standpoint, this climate action recommendation fits squarely within what our regional transportation authority is also recommending. So I think seeing this regional trails plan implemented is an enormously heavy lift. You can see those dotted lines. If they were fully built out, crosses lots of potential private property, requires activation of right-of-ways that might currently be vacant or currently occupied by motorized vehicle roadways. But I think looking at the overall benefit of carbon reduction and building some of that resiliency within our natural ecosystem, this is a very valuable one to push forward. Go next slide, Ellyn. Number 6 here, incorporate climate change risk into all aspects of the county's comprehensive plan. So this is also a potent one for those of you that are familiar with the Growth Management Act, which I believe was passed back in 1990, 1991, which required that all jurisdictions, cities and counties develop these comprehensive plans, which is kind of like our master planning document. Identifies where our priorities are and essentially how we're going to address those priorities. And you can hear my rooster right outside my window. So, some of the more significant nuance of this is, for cities, it's how do you identify your city limits? For counties, where are our resource lands and how do we kind of designate and protect those? Currently, in the 2016 comprehensive plan, Whatcom County comprehensive plan, in our chapter 10 environment chapter was where we first saw mention of climate change. And I believe this was new language added in this 2016 update that basically said climate change is occurring, it's projected to have an impact, and these are some of the key steps that the county can take to address that. And in that, chapter 10 was actually where there was language that stated the county shall create a climate impact advisory committee and task them with updating the county's climate action plan and advising county council and the county administration on how to more effectively prepare for, mitigate impacts of, and adapt to climate change. So the challenge that this specific action recognizes is that currently we've kind of isolated climate change into the environment chapter. But when in reality, if you consider the impacts or the broad scope of climate change, both mitigating our impacts and adapting to the impacts, climate change really has to be infiltrated or kind of integrated into all comp plan chapters. So how does this impact all land uses? How does it affect electrical transmission? How does it affect our stormwater systems? So it really is a significant task. And again, trying to balance what I mentioned previously, the difference between a mandated responsibility and kind of a more programmatic goal and priority, as this climate action plan recommends. Climate change is not currently a mandated requirement under the Growth Management Act. I believe there was a bill at the state legislature last year, and I believe that bill has been reactivated in one form or another this year. So it does appear likely that at some time in the near future, incorporation of climate change into the comprehensive plan, either as a specific goal or just integration more broadly, will become a requirement. I will say that Whatcom County did apply for some grant funding last year through the Department of Commerce, and we had actually the city, the county, and the Port of Bellingham have been cooperating on a staff level through what we call our Joint Climate Action Team. Kind of hatched this idea amongst those staff members to recommend, since the city of Bellingham already has an adopted climate action plan, the county now does as well. we should really be trying to better coordinate with the other jurisdictions in Whatcom County to make sure we can share what we've learned and try to encourage them to take a similar pathway. So we actually had a $30,000 grant through Commerce, partnered with students from Western Washington University, and engaged the small cities of Ferndale, Linden, Blaine, and Nooksack and Everson to be able to try to provide their staff and their councils with some initial thoughts on what would it look like to more effectively integrate climate change into their comp plans. So given that we're coming up on another comp plan update in 2025, this is very appropriately timed and something I think for all of us to start thinking through, how do we achieve this goal? Next one. Okay, another large one: prioritize restoration, function, and protection of wetlands, riparian areas, headwaters, etc., to improve base flows and streams, rivers, to increase carbon storage, and to build resilience to climate impacts. So just to briefly describe this map was actually generated as a contract that we had back with the Purchase of Development Rights Program, which has been renamed the Conservation Easement Program. And when I served as the Purchase of Development Rights Program administrator, working with that oversight committee, kind of had this recognition that we were getting applications from property owners that wanted to protect their land that didn't have 100% agricultural values. So previously the program just focused on protecting ag land, and working with that committee, we were able to actually broaden the scope of the program to be able to purchase these conservation easements on agricultural lands, forestry lands, as well as kind of important ecosystem areas. But in that, we kind of had the recognition that we didn't quite know which ecosystem areas should be the highest priority. How do we kind of dive down into this? So ultimately, this mapping effort compiled a number of data sets that I'm not going to go through today, but this kind of gives you some sense of where some high priority watershed areas could be in the county. But at a base level, from what I do currently with the county, also serving as the lead staff for our watershed management planning efforts as it relates to the Watershed Management Planning Act in our Wire 1 Watershed Management Board work plan, kind of recognizes that a lot of the key ways that we can improve watershed health, which in turn has a very positive nexus with building resiliency to climate impacts, is to really restore, protect the functions and conditions of a lot of these key watershed features. So on this map, you can very clearly see, the Nooksack River corridor and the associated floodplain, key areas for floodplain storage, reducing flood impacts, providing that key habitat for not only salmonids, but other species that utilize those corridors for movement. And again, I think those are some of the areas that could also be utilized for improved carbon storage, et cetera. So this action specifically already kind of integrates pretty directly with what we're doing at the Watershed Management Board level. And I think there's been this recognition at the watershed staff team and the salmon staff team under that board that really we need to be feathering in climate resilience considerations into all of our broad watershed management planning efforts. So I say this one is underway and kind of, again, is just going to benefit from bringing that focus of climate resiliency into this action. Next slide, please. Okay, number 8, ensuring a stable land base for our agricultural economy and promoting renewable energy in ag areas to reduce emissions from farms and provide farmers with new income. So on this map, all the areas you see there in light green are the county's agricultural zoned lands. So we currently have roughly 86,500 acres of ag zone land. And that was designated back at the time when the GMA first came into effect. All those other colored polygons you see on there that have the associated name, those were identified as rural study areas. So, after GMA, fast forward a few years, Whatcom County previously had an ag preservation committee that identified the 100,000 acre goal that I'm sure some of you have heard before. Back in 2009, County Council actually adopted a resolution that stated we as a county want to make sure that we protect and make available for agriculture at least 100,000 acres of agriculture. And currently, like I just said, we only have an 86,000 acre ag zone. So these other colored polygons on the map are areas that currently have a high degree of actively farmed ground, high degree of enrollment in that open space ag current use tax assessment. And they're also highly proximal to our agriculture zone. But currently they are zoned typically R5 or R10. So rural 5 or rural 10, which means those property owners could build one house per 5 acres or one house per 10 acres. And while agriculture can still occur at those smaller acreages, typically what we have seen that once they get developed down to that 5 or 10 acre parcel, they largely are removed from the agricultural land base overall. So the Agricultural Advisory Committee first back in 2007 and then again in 2019 made this recommendation to County Council that, hey, we need to strengthen how these lands are protected. And I'll say that at this point in time, we have not quite figured out what those protections should be. Certain ideas have been pitched. Certain ideas are included in the county's climate action plan with a little bit more detail. But I'm just kind of recognizing that for Whatcom County to allow these agricultural lands to provide the ecosystem services that help us maintain our resiliency to climate impacts, as well as kind of the other component of maintaining and building food security should additional climate impacts occur. Protecting these lands should be the highest, most priority. The other part of this action, kind of promoting renewable energy in ag areas, there is the recognition that, as county government, we don't control the global food market. So raspberry prices, dairy commodity prices are a little bit beyond the scope of what we can impact. So if dairy's having a tough year or berries having a tough year, those farmers suffer. And as we've seen, I think even since I started at the county 8 years ago, I think we had roughly 150 dairies at that point in time. And last time I checked, within the past couple months, I think we're down to 80, 89, 88 dairies. So even in the 8 short years I've been working for the county, we've lost, I think, approximately 50 dairies at the county. So these market fluctuations can be severely impactful to a farm business that is, barely making it as is. So the idea here would be, whether it's solar or wind energy or other forms of renewable energy production, do we have an opportunity to encourage and, make more available for permitting installments of some of these renewable energy systems that could generate additional income for those farmers, help kind of offset some of their tough crop years, or some of these other, if we have another heat dome or big flood season that impacts that farmer's bottom line, could this also help be kind of a complementing factor to preserving that land? Next slide, please. So again, kind of circling back to the county's conservation easement program, previously called the Purchase of Development Rights Program. This recommendation states to increase funding and staff capacity for that program and develop a carbon credit market. So just to kind of walk back and give a base description of the conservation easement program. Ultimately, this looks at property across the county that has one of those 3 values I mentioned, either agricultural, forestry, or ecosystem. And based on the parcel size, the parcel history, and zoning, they typically have a certain number of development rights on the property. And it was previously called the Purchase of Development Rights Program because whenever we purchase an easement, which is the protecting layer that goes on top that we kind of compensate the property owner for, the development rights contributed the most significant portion of the value of that easement. But oftentimes the easement itself could protect other things. It could protect, enhanced riparian buffers, or could ensure that impervious surface did not exceed a certain threshold, or impervious surfaces were not developed in areas where they shouldn't be. Currently, the county has 0.75 FTE assigned to this program. So when we look at how much progress has been made on this program over the years, so those little red outlines on the map indicate areas that the county currently has purchased easements on. It's about 1,500 acres. We've removed approximately 179 development rights, and I don't have the exact financial numbers memorized, but I think that's roughly the equivalent of 10 million of county dollars. And with that 10 million, we've been able to actually bring in closer to 12 or 13 million dollars of non-local, both state and federal match to be able to make these purchases occur. And I will state from my experience supporting that program, there is an enormous amount of matching funds out there. And really with increased staffing capacity, you would have the ability to recruit additional funds, non-local funds. County Council did take a significant first step this past year and actually voted and approved an increase to the Conservation Futures levy rate, which had not been increased in a long time. I don't have the exact timeline on that. So that was, I think, pretty great for staff to see, and relevant to this climate action plan, some commitment from council to actually put some local dollars, increase some local dollars towards that acquisition. The last portion of this, develop a carbon credit market. Carbon credit transactions are not a new thing. There is the American Carbon System Registry. There's an International Carbon System Registry, and I think a lot of other versions of registries out there. So for Whatcom County to enact certain carbon credit transactions does not in and of itself require that we create our whole new program. It would really just require that we assign some staff time to try to pilot out a few carbon credit transactions. So that's a tool that could be as simple as promoting cover cropping and trying to make sure that we're increasing soil organic matter in agricultural landscapes, or it could look at forested landscapes to increase the rotational length from a 40-acre harvest, or a 40-year harvest timeline to an 80 or 100-year harvest timeline, or could be similar to what I think King County has done, where those carbon credits are actually kind of permanent and lock up the carbon storage long term. Go to the next slide, please. So this last action, expand a county-hosted database hub with geo-referenced environmental measures that are routinely collected by various organizations in the county. I think a lot of you, if you're here today, likely have an interest in better understanding, number one, what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what sorts of progress are we making. So I think we recognize that for us to be effective in our jobs, we need to not only be accountable to the community, but to be able to effectively communicate to the community how we're doing, what we've done and how we've done that. So currently the county, and I believe the city of Bellingham as well, operate largely off of an ArcGIS platform. So this is a geographic information system, kind of geo-reference mapping interface that allows us to map a whole slew of data, something as basic as tax parcels and roads, all the way down to wetlands and stream buffers, soil types, etc. So I think there's, I guess in watershed world where I work, we've actually started to develop this watershed data hub where I'm able to share with our watershed partners, such as the tribes and the cities and the state departments, to share our watershed data and make sure we're all using up-to-date information. And I think with this climate nexus, we have the ability to do something comparable to that effect. So the one snapshot I have up there is more of a dashboard function where, looking at either a county municipal buildings, we could actually track our emissions over time and kind of visually provide a reference to, these are the actions that the county has taken. This is the resulting reduction that has occurred, and this is our planned reduction over the future. Similarly, we could expand that out across the community and start to provide some of that mapping interface as well. So you can see, this is where we've made progress. This is where we still have work to do, and try to communicate more effectively so that we all understand what actions we've taken have made an impact, and what actions we still have to come. I think that's it. Let's go to the next slide, Ellyn. And I'll take a first go at this, Ellyn, and then maybe I'll let you follow up. So Ellyn and I talked a little bit, thinking about the audience today and trying to help provide some direction on where we go from here. So, how specifically can you help with staff support and supporting the committee and making sure this climate action plan goes forward is to, communicate directly with county leadership and with county council to let them know about your concerns or recommendations and where your own priorities for seeing climate action occur out in the county. Certainly volunteer for the Climate Impact Advisory Committee or other organizations that are advocating for local climate action. As with all county advisory committees, all of our meetings are subject to the Open Public Meetings Act. We try to post those up on our committee webpage, and I'd encourage any and all of you to attend those meetings. We do have some pretty valuable and insightful discussion first Thursday of every month. Join the community conversation on climate change on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll let Ellyn tackle that on the next slide. And then register and vote in your local city and county elections. And I'll pass it back to you, Ellyn.
Yeah, that last one, I had to say I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. So additional information, the Whatcom County Climate Action Plan and related reports are available at this link. It's somewhat hard to find on the county website, but it is posted there. And volunteers on the Climate Impact Advisory Committee have established 2 private accounts, and these are not associated with county government. We can't, we're not representatives of the county government. We have a Twitter account and an Instagram account now. So we're just trying to promote a more of a conversation here in the county on climate action. And this is for questions, but I also wanted to acknowledge the primary authors of the different chapters within the climate action plan. And it was a heroic effort. We're all volunteers, and it took a lot of time to put this together. But anyway, these are the people that are responsible for this climate action plan finally being completed. And with that, we'll open it up to questions. Jane, I think you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think the last slide sort of showed something of what you're planning to do. I assume this means that the committee is going to stay as a committee. Your work is not done, and now maybe the plan is for educating the community and getting this passed through the county council. Is that sort of what I got from this? Is that right? And I wanted to know what roadblocks you foresee and what is a timeline that you're thinking of to get some of these things done. I think you mentioned at one point that certain things you were going to concentrate on.
Yes, I think we're reaching a stage now of implementation, and we're just trying to keep the communication going with the county leadership and understanding what we think needs to be done, and pushing different areas. There are many more actions and strategies within the climate action plan. We just touched on the first year priorities, the things to get started as soon as possible. But there's a whole range of different areas that need to be addressed. For example, one of the areas in transportation was to have a bulk EV buying process where an organization sponsors and negotiates for lower electric vehicle costs. And I know that Sue Gunn has a high interest in this, and she's looking at some of the pros and cons of different ways of establishing this type of program. So different people on the committee, I hope, are going to go ahead and press different areas. one of our leadership areas was to really start letting the state legislators and the Department of Commerce and the UTC know what our needs are to really accomplish climate change, reduction of emissions and so forth in the county. And to let that be known, to have a more communication with these people and so they know how important this is to us. The climate action manager would ultimately be responsible for this activity, but there's a lot to keep track of. So
Mhm.
we're just trying to help the process to get it going.
Okay.
Chris, did you want to add any?
I don't think so. And that is an enormous question, Jane. And I will say that, since we do have funding available for hiring of this climate action manager, we are currently trying to finalize that job description and figure out how to actually get someone on board. Ellyn kind of initially made reference to, I have the benefit of working in watershed world and have significant intersections with other long range planning efforts. So I've been trying to incorporate kind of climate resilience planning into our natural resource scope, but we don't have a lot of expertise or kind of targeted expertise on the built environment or transportation, trying to tackle some of those efforts. So, wherever possible, we're trying to incorporate climate action into existing programs. And then I think there's also the recognition that some of this is going to be kind of a cold start or a new program. And we are in the administration trying to figure out how can we do this most effectively. And I guess I will say that the benefit I've had, or I think the county's had, at engaging with City of Bellingham staff and Port of Bellingham staff, and even beyond that out to the small cities and tribes, is that a lot of our community partners do know more about some of these other climate action strategies than county staff do. And we've had the real benefit of being able to share ideas and try to hopefully eventually, where we've been going with a few pilot projects, share implementation of some of these climate action solutions.
Mhm. We hear a lot about community solar. What does community solar look like, and how would you see that being implemented in the near future? Either one of you.
Well, community solar is actually having more local solar available, especially people who don't have the solar exposure for rooftop solar. And the way I would like to see it is that it would be an actual cheaper form of electricity than our current electricity, and that more people can participate in it, especially people who are renting and so they can't put solar on their rooftops and other areas. So there's probably going to be a big issue on net metering coming up in the legislature. I don't know if it'll come up this year or next year, on what kind of reimbursement people should get. I know I mentioned Minnesota and their fast growth. They allow competition, so a group of investors could come in and create a solar field and be able to hook into the existing transmission and distribution lines. And so that's really created fast growth in Minnesota. They also
Does that mean we don't allow
uh,
competition?
I think, and I'm not an expert on the legal aspects of Washington, but I think you would have to get permission from the utility to use that, to use their distribution and transmission lines. Anyway, and there's also other areas like I said, the reimbursement, the net metering. I know Minnesota, the UTC is very progressive, and they basically calculate every year or every other year what that rate reimbursement will be. And they take into account things like the social cost of carbon and so forth. So when they look at it holistically and the health advantages and so forth, solar power is very attractive.
Mhm.
Anyway, so they look at other states that have had great growth in it and then try to accommodate, some of those laws in the US. We also need, in Washington, and we also need virtual net metering, and which I don't think that's allowed right now in Washington. So that would require a change in the law too.
So if we electrify everything, and that's now gas, and electrify our vehicles, is there concern about the enormous strain on the electrical grid, which you mentioned was 40 to 50 years old and not in very good shape?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, when I was working at Pacific Northwest National Lab, they were talking about modernization of the grid and smart grid 20 years ago. And honestly, we really have to get going in these areas and try to modernize our grid. I was just reading recently. I can pull it up. This was a Puget Sound Energy put this out. It was talking about how Puget Sound Energy handled the historic 2021 heat dome. And I'll read this directly from it. In short, the temperature stress caused by the heat dome resulted in more equipment failures in our system during the 12-day period of 2021 than the 3 previous years during the same period combined. So yeah, we do need to modernize our grid and increase capacity.
And is there enough solar and wind to handle that capacity?
Not installed, but
No.
yes, they're solar and wind is actually free. And yes, there's enough solar hitting the Earth's surface to accommodate.
Okay. So what personal lifestyle adjustments should we be making? And how receptive do you expect the public to be to these changes?
Well, for me, we bought electric bikes and we're really enjoying riding those electric bikes. I mean, there's all kinds of different things people can do, personal lifestyle, recycling waste, and so forth. So I'm sure, you can go out on the web and see all kinds of things that you can do as an individual to reduce your carbon footprint.
I'm just very impressed, always have been. We have one of the best trail systems in the United States. We all know that. And it's getting better all the time. But how many people actually use those trail systems for anything more than recreation? I mean, for actually, when I think about the idea that they want to connect Ferndale to Bellingham on a system, how many people are going to use that to ride the bike to work to Bellingham, from Ferndale to Bellingham? That to me would be a huge change in people's lifestyle. And we do have a lot of rain here.
Mhm. It's amazing how many people do commute though, using their bikes. I mean, I remember in 2019, when we interviewed the Port of Bellingham, they had put up a protected bike shed because there were so many of their employees were biking directly to work. So it does happen. You have to make it easy. You have to make it safe. Safety is a huge issue. And I don't know, just walking along some of the rail trails at different times of the day, if it's earlier or late afternoon, you do see people commuting.
Mhm.
And I'll just jump in briefly on that fact. I do live in the South Fork Valley, and again, trying to have a low carbon footprint to get from the county into the city is pretty challenging. I had the
Mhm.
benefit of living next to the bus stop in Van Zant, so I could bike from my house to the Van Zant bus stop, put my bike on the bus, get dropped downtown, and that was pretty functional. So I think, if we're trying to, as a county government, make those sorts of alternative multimodal, multi-transit, non-motorized opportunities more viable. Kind of the key point Ellyn mentioned was the safety factor. Currently, there's been a prioritization to do these bike lanes on road, which makes perfect sense from a financial standpoint, where the county has the right of way. We just make a little extra shoulder for bikes. But I think for a lot of people, if you're looking for broad adoption, it's a risk that a lot of us are not interested in taking.
Mhm.
So, I think what Bellingham has done with actually kind of creating some segregated bike lanes, obviously the Boulevard Trail being the gold standard of having kind of a dedicated non-motorized pathway, which makes it safer for kids, for families. Then you actually create the infrastructure that actually supports people in being a little bit more willing to not get in their car and to use those pathways for not only recreation purposes, but also for going to the store or going to the doctor. So the city feels like they're on a pretty good track, and I think really need to find a way to prioritize that for the county as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one last question, then we'll turn it over to everybody else. But if you had control over an unlimited county budget, what would be the most important piece to fund for climate resiliency? You can start, Chris.
No, you were talking to Ellyn, I thought.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess I was not prepared for that question. I mean, I'm a landscape kind of a watershed management and resiliency guy. So certainly the rate of development and how we are developing and managing a lot of our landscapes is limiting our ability to be resilient long term. So, even from my time working as the Purchase of Development Rights Program administrator, putting easements on the ground, it might be for farms that farming practices are not 100%, climate neutral or climate resilient. But ultimately, the thing we can do as a community is protect that land so that we at least have the opportunity to make improvements to our management processes in the future. So, looking into the uplands, forested landscape, looking at our floodplains, looking at our agricultural landscapes, looking at our shorelines, the cost to protect a lot of those areas is enormous. And currently we are restricted by local dollars and kind of the staff capacity to pursue those other non-local dollars. But I'm on the resiliency end of thing, and I do recognize that the mitigation and kind of emissions reduction tasks also carry an enormous budget requirement.
What do you say, Ellyn?
Well, I think right now, one of the biggest limitation is staff. I mean, Chris always seems to be 110 or 120% committed. So it's really, we really need more staff capacity to tackle climate change. And, I'm really happy that we do have funding for a climate action manager, but like I said, we also need someone who can actually set up a website and actually track the success or even failure of our strategies and actions. It's so important to be able to measure these things, and that was a big problem, as you probably remember, when we were interviewing people back in 2019. They oftentimes people talk about, well, yeah, we did update the lighting in this government building. Well, how much energy did you save? I don't know. So it's just trying to look at the cost versus the results, and it is really important. So
Sure.
just more staff capacity. Even, I mean, I was even surprised that so many of the funding opportunities that are out there right now from the U.S. Department of Energy, the some of the infrastructure bills, funding, and so forth, requires staff time to write proposals.
Sure.
Otherwise, it doesn't get done. So that is something else that's very important.
Okay, so Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you now with some questions from our audience.
Okay. Well, we have a whole bunch of nice questions. And as a good follow-up to what we were just talking about, David asked, and Chris answered this in the question and answer, but I think it's the question for everybody. Has a decision been made whether the Climate Action Manager and Office of Climate Action will be housed within the Planning Department or stand on its own? When do you suspect the manager will be hired? And to that end, Judy has asked, to whom will the Climate Action Manager report?
Yeah, I can just follow up. I wrote a little bit of a response there. Currently, the Climate Action Manager is planned to be housed within the Natural Resource Division of Public Works. So, direct chain of command would go up to the Public Works Director, but the Executive's Office is also in the process of hiring this new position, the Director of Strategic Initiatives. So we do have a direct main line to the Executive Office as well. And I'll say that in some of our discussions, both in the Climate Action Plan and what we've talked about within the administration, also includes development of an internal staff climate action team. So this Climate Action Manager will report up, as I kind of just described, but we also have the benefit of trying to build this larger staff infrastructure to be able to accommodate a lot of the priority actions that need to occur.
Okay. My favorite commentator, the anonymous attendee, asks, many of the personal actions one can take come at a cost and have limited accessibility. Are there plans to address inequities in accessibility and incorporate environmental social justice into the county's climate action plan? That is to say, inequitable impacts of climate change on some communities more than others.
Yes, one of the guiding principles in the first section of the Climate Action Plan is to social and environmental justice and equity. So my feeling on this is you can design programs so they are equitable. And I feel personally that if we go after different pieces of federal fund and our federal funds and are successful, those should be focused on low-income communities and areas that are most affected by climate change. And so, I mean, I think we need to pay attention to this. It's an extremely important issue. But it's one that we can address. Chris, do you want
to? Yeah, I mean, that's a significant one. And I think I will say, even from a match funding or a grant standpoint, I mean, essentially, if we take any dollars from any other location, we are always kind of required to clearly demonstrate how we've effectively considered kind of the equitable impacts of any proposed project. So it is always a requirement that front and center we have planned around that. I will say that specifically on some certain coastal resilience and, watershed resilience projects we're working on, it's been refreshing to see a lot more engagement with the tribes, both Lummi and Nooksack, and trying to encourage them to not only take a leadership role in a lot of these projects, but also make sure that we're fully accommodating a lot of their needs. So I think there's been at least from my time working with the county, it's been pretty refreshing to see a lot more engagement with the tribes in trying to kind of co-develop a lot of these climate resilience strategies and actions.
And Clifford has a great follow-up. He says, the initial 10 initiatives identified represent broad actions within the county. What are the funding plans to achieve these initiatives? And
Yeah,
I would add to that, who's responsible for finding the money?
I'll take a first go, Ellen. You can follow up. Each one of those initiatives likely has a substantially different funding reality. I mean, certain initiatives probably already have a partial local funding source where funds could be used to recruit that. In other scenarios, federal or state matching funds are going to be required to really get some of those off the ground. And kind of to Ellen's previous point, staff capacity to pursue those state and federal funds is oftentimes the most significant limiting factor. I mean, I can only go after so many grants and manage so many grants effectively. So staff capacity, or even to a certain degree staff assignment to pursue those types of grants is still something being developed.
Mhm.
And I guess maybe beyond that, again, thinking through the coordination we've had with the city of Bellingham and the port of Bellingham, there are other ways to generate funds that could support development of new specific climate actions. And whether you look at kind of the natural gas franchise fee possibility or other local levies that have not previously existed, certainly there's a range of options that have been considered. And I'll say that we don't have 100% clear pathway forward on how we're going to fund all of these actions.
I'll also add that the State Department of Commerce has a state energy fund. And if I heard this right, I think Jay Inslee said yesterday at a solar summit that he wants to augment that fund by 100 million. Have the legislature do that this term, but whether that happens or not, I don't know. But they fund quite a few different types of projects, and here's where the whole equity issue comes in again. If the county had the staff capacity to hold some workshops, find out maybe where the best places would be to put resilience centers in place. That's one area that has been funded. People talk about cooling centers because of the heat wave last year, but these are also emergency shelters that should have their own source of electricity during a prolonged disaster. So they're funding these types of programs, but again, it takes the staff capacity to write the proposal and go after that funding and do the groundwork ahead of time to understand where the most vulnerable communities are located and what can be done to address those vulnerabilities.
Okay, and along all those lines, Davy, I hope that I pronounced that correctly, asks, are there any state Senate or House bills that you're particularly watching, or we should particularly watch right now that might support some of our county level goals?
Yes, there are. I don't have a list of them in front of me, unfortunately. But Alex Rammel is reintroducing a bill on building electrification for multifamily dwellings and let's see. Oh, I can't keep track of all of them. I was looking at some of the Jay Inslee's proposals. He put out a list of different areas that need to be instituted. Let's see. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'd have to get a list. The League of Women Voters also has a list of climate actions, environmental and climate actions that come out. They come out weekly telling people, well, if you're in favor of this bill, you can testify. Frankly, I haven't had a lot of time lately to investigate these in great detail.
Okay, well, you mean you're not comprehensively aware of everything in the world?
No, not at all.
Getting down to some specific issues, Brian asks, what impact will the State Department of Ecology adjudication of water rights on the Nooksack Basin have on the county climate change goals and plans?
That's that's one of the many million-dollar questions. Certainly, I will say, serving as one of the staff on Executive Sadhu's kind of internal team as he tries to help launch what he's termed our kind of watershed solutions table. I mean, ultimately, I think we recognize that an adjudication in and of itself helps clarify legal water access, legal water rights, but does not in and of itself address water supply issues or support individuals or entities that maybe do not have legal water access. So I think the adjudication has been effective in rattling everyone's nerves a little bit and kind of getting everyone kind of up to attention. And I think what we're hoping is that that during this time where adjudication is likely proceeding, that we are also becoming prepared and ready to engage in a broader kind of watershed solutions suite of actions. So, we are trying to tackle that. I guess I will say, how do we broadly integrate and be successful in achieving broad watershed health? And I think we recognize that if we can get the support of the tribes and the agricultural community and the city and the PUD and many others, and actually affect, water use efficiency efforts, affect restoration of fish habitats, affect a whole broad suite of actions, that will be an effective complement to what the adjudication will likely bring.
So, Jane, do we have time for one more? Okay, once again, getting back to a specific sort of issue, Michelle asked, I'm paraphrasing here, does the SEAC and the county plan to consult with and advise school districts and other public entities about climate change resiliency when they begin to plan and construct new buildings?
Well, I believe that's probably more towards the individual cities where the school districts are located. I hope that they would be consulting with those school districts on this very topic. And I know that there is a big sustainability push in some of the school districts, and they're starting to think about these different areas. Certainly, electrification of school buses would be a great improvement. Safe trails and walking to different schools is important. I have a daughter who works in transportation in Seattle, And she told me over Christmas that 25% of the morning commute in Seattle are people taking their kids to school. And I thought, wow, that is really high. And I'm sure it didn't used to be that way. Anyway, so Jane, maybe you can comment on that since you interviewed some of the school districts last time in transportation.
Well, that was brought up. And of course, you know, the limiting factor on the school buses is money to just as it is with the Whatcom transportation. You know, they'd like to immediately do all of their buses to electric, but it takes money and they do cost considerably more. But they did mention a lot of things that they had tried in terms of, and this is why I asked about lifestyle changes too, is because of, you know, carpooling and that kind of thing. And it doesn't seem to be part of our makeup right now as much as it used to be. And when the schools are located in the neighborhood, and I remember my children going to and my grandchildren too, going to Columbia school, it was in the neighborhood and they all walked. They didn't take the bus. They didn't, you know, unless it was pouring down rain, their mothers didn't take them. So, you know, those are the factors. And I think that it is something that the school should be encouraged to take into consideration. Of course, building a school, you have to find the land to buy and put it on that they can afford and that kind of thing. And I think that's why sometimes we see schools that, I won't mention a particular one, seems like it's in a bad situation for walking to school, but there you go.
I will mention too that the price of electric buses is really declining because the price of batteries have been declining drastically. So, and now we have a new company in Ferndale that is assembling electric buses. So it's something to keep our eyes on because I think it is coming.
And I think, you know, when we talk about, you know, I was interested in Chris talking about Van Zant and being able to take his bike to a bus and get in. I mean, those kind of things. And I talked to the Whatcom transportation at the time, and they're all in on that. You know, they want to do that and have those routes out in the county that people can get to easily to get into jobs wherever they are in the county. So let's look forward to that and hope it all happens in the schools and in the community. I think we're just about at the end of our time now. And I think we all really appreciate the work that Ellyn and Chris and the rest of the people that were on that committee did. This is an enormous undertaking, and I think they gave us some good ideas as citizens who we should be talking to and encouraging for the terms of getting more staff. Met was one of the biggest ones at the county, and also to our legislatures about the kind of Alex and Sharon, all of them are working hard on these different things. And I don't remember the names of all the bills at the time too, but I check my legislative newsletter all the time to check and make sure that they get a yes to vote on that. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Ellyn and Chris. You did a great job.
Thank you.